Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Carteropoli, Associate Director of Visitor Services and Public Programs Manager. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's virtual program, Yiddish Around the World with Christa P. Whitney. Before we get started, please note that your audio will be muted and your video off throughout the program. You may send questions via the question panel at the lower right of your screen. Please keep them short and refrain from comments so we can get to all the questions. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter and my colleague, Christa P. Whitney. Christa is the director of the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project. Originally from Northern California, Christa discovered Yiddish while studying comparative literature, Jewish studies, and dance at Smith College. She has studied Yiddish at the Yiddish Book Center, the Vilnius Yiddish Institute, and the Worker Circle. Since 2009, through her work with the Wexler Oral History Project, she has traveled near and far in search of Yiddish stories and has produced several documentaries featuring Yiddish luminaries. Welcome, Christa.
Shalom Aleichem. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thanks to my colleagues for having me on tonight. It's a real treat to get to share some highlights of the wonderful stories I've had the honor of recording over the last 15 years. So first of all, just want to say a couple more words about myself. So I'm from Northern California, but here I am today zooming in from Western Massachusetts. My ancestors came to this part of the world from England when it was then unceded Nipmuc, Pocumtuck, and Abenaki land. And others of my ancestors come from some of the lands we'll be talking about today, from Lithuania and Ireland. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. So when I say Yiddish culture, what places come to mind? Take a moment to think about it. I want you to hold those places in your mind as we do our virtual tour today. And I encourage you to think at the end of this hour that we'll be spending together tonight, whether any of your associations with Yiddish and place may be disrupted by some of the stories that we'll be looking at tonight. So Yiddish is a global culture. Why is that? So migration, and many of you know some of the reasons for the migration of Yiddish speakers. Persecution and violence, of course, is a reason why people leave lands and move to other lands. Also, hopes for economic improvement and or to join family or friends in other places. Once Yiddish spread out across the globe, local Yiddish cultures developed in addition to the extended diasporic network of Yiddish culture from Eastern Europe. This is why I've found it so interesting and felt so lucky to get to know Yiddish speakers and cultural centers in so many places. I've become fascinated by the way that Yiddish simultaneously maintains its Eastern European tom, its flavor, and is molded by the local culture as Yiddish speakers adapt to the lands that they travel to. Thus, Yiddish culture in Brazil looks simultaneously recognizable and very different to Yiddish culture in Toronto or Helsinki or Melbourne or London. So just in case any of you don't know about the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project, a bit of context. We have been collecting video oral history interviews since 2010. They are usually about 1 to 2 hours long. We're not going to watch full interviews tonight, but there are many hundreds of hours if any of you are interested in such materials. They're mostly recorded in Yiddish and English, but we have many other languages in the collection now as well. And we have actually, this number is outdated, over 1,400 interviews have been recorded to date. and we've recorded in 21 countries. So this collection is such a treasure trove of stories that it was difficult for me to figure out what to present in this presentation. In 2023, we took the whole year to do a tour of Yiddish around the world. So I'm drawing on that work, which was in conjunction and sort of leading up to the opening of our new permanent exhibition at the Yiddish Book Center, which also explores some themes about Yiddish around the world. So tonight we'll be looking at, we'll be doing, I'll give you a very incomplete tour of Yiddish and Yiddish speakers around the world. And we'll be highlighting both the parallels that are among many communities of Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews around the world, such as, the staples of Jewish life, foodways, shul, and religious beliefs and practice, and some examples of the organizations that maintain Yiddish culture. So this would be schools, libraries, theater, choirs, youth groups, and radio. One of the things that has certainly influenced my work is over the last several years, I've been working on a degree in business administration, and this has highlighted for me the importance of institutions. And so that's certainly in the background of how I think about things, as all education, inevitably influences our worldview. One caveat is I'm not a specialist in all of these Jewish communities. So my aim today is that I'll give you a bit of historical context for each example that I show, but I encourage you to seek out the work of scholars who specialize in these particular communities. For most of these places, there are wonderful books about the Jewish community in each of these places. So since I'm the one making the selection, it's my prerogative to start with a community that's of special importance to me, which is Vilna. So just some brief facts again to give context. So there's over 500 years of Jewish history in Vilna. By the mid-1600s, Jews made up approximately a quarter of Vilna's population. Over the years, as with many places in Eastern Europe, the city has been controlled by several different kingdoms, rulers, and nation-states. It came to be known as Yerushalayim Delita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, in recognition of it being a center of Jewish thought and publishing. And many important Yiddish organizations and figures were born in Vilna. And there was, of course, a decimation of this community during the Holocaust, and around 6,000 Jews returned to Vilna after World War II and the Holocaust. So we're going to start with a video here from someone that I hope some of you will recognize, the wonderful Binyamin Harshav, Zichrona Livracha, and a scholar and poet and translator of Yiddish who grew up in Vilna. So here is a story from pre-World War II Vilna.
Ich bin 11 Jahre alt, aber ich hatte eine Klasse von Folklore-Literatur. Sie hat uns geschickt, ich bin eine Lehrerin, sie hat uns geschickt auf einen Fischmarkt. Und auf dem Fischmarkt, ich habe das beschrieben, aber sie dort noch rein ist, durch ein Plätzl mit einem Kaffee und das ist als ein Fischmarkt. Ist auf dem Fischmarkt die Sitzerkäse, ob sie geht. Sie gehen im Winter, haben sie gehabt, als einen Emmer mit heißen Keulen und sie haben untergeheben sehr Skirt, sehr, wie sagt man, und gesessen auf dem heißen Top, der Feiertop und geschrien, gefeulte Äpperlach, verfeulte Äpperlach, Das heißt, es hat verkauft, etwas, was anscheinend ein bisschen verfreuen, ein bisschen, kann man nehmen weniger Geld. Es hat man uns geschickt dahin und wir haben gesehen, eine Idene, was ich heim gerade als Mame. Was sie gesagt, sie gewesen als Sitzer in Mark und das ist gewesen für unsere, das hat heim gerade. Der größte Poet ist, aber Hecher, auf dem Sof von dem Platz, ein bisschen am Berg, ihr versteht, man geht von der Vilna, ist auf links ist da der Gaona Museum und auf rechts Farbenmuseum ist gewesen der Markt. Das ist ein Café, ist, ja, ist, wie macht man, wie kleibt man Folklore? Clawless. Ist wegen mir gekommen zu sehr nah zu den Fischerkästen, der verkauft Fisch. Und die Fischerkäste haben gemeint, wir gehen ganz von dem Fisch. Haben sie uns gejagt. Haben sie gesagt, klar, das verschiedene. Das einzige klar, was ich verschrieben, was ich denke, ist, ich will machen von deiner Kischkes ein Telefon. Weil der Schnur vom Telefon, da ist er doch mit Kischkes. Ist das gewesen, der die Warum haben wir gleich verschrieben. Ist gewesen als erfolgsstimulige Kultur.
So I'll just give a footnote on that one. As happens with all second languages, one improves over time. So there are a few typos in those subtitles that I'd hoped to correct today, but we had a snow day here in Western Massachusetts. So when he's talking about the apples, that they're not exactly rotten, but actually frozen. And also later, the fisherwomen were not actually hitting them, but actually like chasing them off. So we're always improving our language and try not to have too much embarrassment about that. So next from Vilna, we're going to go to Bulawayo. So a bit about Jewish history in Bulawayo. So Rhodesia was administered by the British South African Company in the 19th century and exploited for mineral extraction. And Jews were among the early British colonizers in Bulawayo. So by 1900, there were about 300 Jewish residents in Bulawayo. And then by the late 60s, over 3,000 members of just the Bulawayo Hebrew congregation. In 1965, Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence was declared, and a civil war ensued. And this led to an exodus of Jews from the region. By 1980, there was a peace agreement, and Bulawayo became the second largest city in what is now known as Zimbabwe. So here we're going to hear a story from someone who grew up in Bulawayo. Here we go. So can you describe the home that you grew up in?
Yes, I have to say we grew up in a privileged environment. Eventually, the way it looked to me, this is my perspective, is that as long as we were white, it didn't really matter that we were Jewish. We were important in the count of white, in a census of white citizens, because of the political situation. We had wonderful education in school, public schools. The Hebrew Day School did not start till I was already in high school. So I missed that part. But I went to Cheder, and it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot at Cheder. I loved I love languages and I loved learning Hebrew. There were all sorts of possibilities. We had a rabbi from England when I was growing up there. The shul was European in style. There was a lot of availability of kosher food. We had a sheikhet. I remember my mother loading chickens that we kept we had a very big garden, chickens that we had in a little coop in the back with one thing I didn't tell, which I think you know, and was that help was very accessible and available. And we had a lot of help around the house. And one of the helpers worked in the garden, and he would load chickens, took care of the chickens. So he would put chickens in the back of the car, and we would drive them down to near the shul where the sheikhet would slaughter them. And I remember, I don't know what my mother was thinking, but I remember seeing these chickens running around without their heads on. And then they would be brought home in a sack, and then we had a cook who would spend hours defeathering them, and then with over a methylated spirits flame, sterilizing them, and then trying to get all the pieces of feather that were left. It was, I watched all this. I was an observer. Didn't even remember that I knew all that, but so we had a very privileged, safe upbringing. There was a large influx of Lithuanians, Litvaks, but there were also a lot of people who came from England because this was a British colony. And the two met and accepted each other and formed a community. It almost came like there were the barons who were a formidable presence in the community because they had established their great-grandparents had established many aspects of the community. A shul was built almost immediately, the shul. They just took off as a Jewish community, and they thrived. They started off in tiny little stores near the railway line at the railway station, because that's where there was no river. You know, usually in a city with a river, that's where all the development starts, and then it goes outwards. So this mainly started around the railway station, and then was built in. They were almost like dynasty families from the founding fathers, and nobody left. Nobody left until the political situation became unsettled in the 60s. That's when the 50s and 60s, and then you started seeing children leaving and not coming back.
I love these two examples because I think you see the context. I love the way Gita sort of lays out the context of the Jewish community and the way which institutions were central, as well as the home life. So far we've seen sort of Yiddish in the market, Yiddish at home, at shul. You know, Gita doesn't talk specifically about language, but I know from other parts of the interview that Yiddish was very much present in her youth as she's describing it here. So next up, we spin the globe and land in Toronto. So again, just some quick facts about the community and the history. So the first record of Jewish immigration to Toronto dates back to the early 19th century. There was, as in much of the Americas, a larger wave of Jewish immigration to Toronto beginning in the 1880s. And in 1911, 18,000 Jews lived in Toronto. There was a Yiddish newspaper, radio show in the 20th century, and there were 3 Yiddish schools, and one school in Toronto still offers Yiddish to today. After World War II, some immigration restrictions loosened, and there was an influx of Jewish refugees who joined and had their own influence on the Jewish community in Toronto. So here we're going to hear a story again from someone who grew up in this community, perhaps known to some of you. Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimblett is a well-known scholar, ethnographer, and museum professional. And here we go.
My father had a wallpaper and paint store in an immigrant neighborhood in Toronto on Roncesvalles Avenue. And the immigrants there were largely Polish and Ukrainian and not Jewish. And he spoke Polish and could understand and communicate in other Slavic languages all the time. And I can remember that when I was a kid, I used to help out in the store, and they once put a sign. Well, what happened was this: the Wallpaper and Paint Association would give you $5 if you sent in a true story that they printed. And so I sent in a true story that they printed. I won $5. What was the story? The story was that my father's assistant had put a sign in the window, and it said, "Mamo po polsku, אנחנו מדברים עברית, nous parlons français, wir reden Yiddish, wir sprechen Deutsch." And a little old lady came into the store and looked around and she said, "Anybody here speak English?" I got $5 for that.
I love that story. Gives you a sense of, again, the context in which Yiddish, this multilingual context. So I'm going to move us along because we have a few more stops on our tour. So now we're going south to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So Brazil boasts the first recorded Jewish community in the Americas. The first Jewish community was formed in the country's northeast in Recife, and by Portuguese Jews from Holland during the Dutch occupation of that region. The first synagogue in the Americas was established there. The first Yiddish-speaking Jews likely arrived during, again, the waves of migration. They're a little later than in North America. The larger waves started around the turn of the 20th century. Between 1926 and 1942, more than 50,000 Jews entered Brazil. In Rio, we have Yiddish newspapers, theater group, cultural center. There was a period from 37 to 45 called the Estado Novo, the dictatorial period. This led to the forced closure of many Jewish organizations, including the Yiddish press. In 45, a more democratic constitution reestablished some stability in Jewish life. And nowadays, there's very exciting recent effort called Viver com Yiddish, Leben für Yiddish, or Live with Yiddish, an initiative to revitalize Yiddish in Rio. And it was in conjunction with this project that I was able to go to Rio and spend several weeks conducting oral histories in Yiddish there. So here we're going to hear from a brother and sister about their youth and their parents' influence on the Yiddish community in Rio.
Der Tagesgefolg, der Wohnführer, der Direktor. Und die Mama hat ihm geholfen, neue dort. Und sie haben nicht gehabt kein Geld. Haben sie beschlossen zu wohnen in der Schule. Und und sie haben beschlossen, weil die Mama hat gehabt einen Verdienst. A Stelle, sie hat verdient. Und sie haben beschlossen, sie werden wohnen in einer kleinen Zimmer in Schule, Tag in Schule. Und er wird nicht, wird nicht verdienen. Und er hat gewohnt dort, und ich bin gewohnt in einem kleinen Zimmer in Schule, wo ich habe gewohnt knapp 6 Jahre. Ich gedenke, alle haben sich mit mir gespielt. Ich gedenke, alle haben mir gerufen, Schemegele. Ich gedenke, es ist gewesen im Badezimmer, und wenn die Sonne gewesen, Schiller ist gewesen schwer.
Erzähl die meiste von der Szene, von der Welt.
Die Mama pflegt erzählen, sie pflegt sein sehr versorgt, als der Glecken von Schuss und nicht durchgehabt vom Schlaf. Weil er hat geklungen. Und ich kann sich vorstellen, wie es gewesen schwer. So hat von einer kleinen Mädel in der Schule mit Kindern, mit dem Badzimmer, mit den Gefäßen, die man hat gegessen, das gedenke ich nicht. Person hat gegessen, aber ich gedenke, wie man hat sich gespielt mit mir, ich bin herumgegangen zwischen die Schüler in der Schule und alle haben gesagt, das mir. I was pampered. Und ich gedenke, wie zu Tag saß, wenn ich bin rein in den Kindergarten, wenn ich bin geworden 5 Jahre in den Kindergarten, es gab nativ, leben nativ, mein Zimmer und dort der Kindergarten. Da geh in Schule, wo ist Schule? Da. Und ich will nicht. Und er hat, also bin ich gegangen, von nativ, leben nativ. Das gedenke ich sehr gut. Wenn ich begebe, und ich habe dort, später, und nach dem, wenn er ist.
Noch, wenn ich bin geboren geworden, seien sie gegangen zur Stutt.
Er hat gedungen,
eine kleine Direle.
So again, we're sort of not going into too much analysis, but you can see here the different places and the different institutions that are popping up as people are talking about their communities. So, just think about the commitment to education and the development of a Yiddish school that one had to have to make that kind of decision for one's family. It's really interesting. So next we're going to stay in the Southern Hemisphere and go across to Melbourne, Australia. So again, just the cliff notes of the history here. So the first Jews arrived in Australia in 1788 with the first fleet, the English ships that brought convicts to the new penal colony. After the Second World War, Australia had relatively lenient visa restrictions compared with other countries in the world, and this led to an influx of Jewish refugees, including many Yiddish speakers from Europe. There is an organization institution called the Kadima in Melbourne. It was established in 1911. And this became a gathering place. It was established as a gathering place and remains to this day an institution where people interested in Yiddish language, theater, literature, and culture gather. There have been, actually to this day, there's still a Yiddish radio show, a youth group of the Bund Jewish Socialist Movement, and Yiddish is taught in the classrooms of the Sholem Aleichem College, a Jewish day school. So here we're going to be highlighting the institution of the Kadima, which part of its history has been as a center of Yiddish theater. We'll be hearing from Arnold Zabel, a writer.
We will go to the Yiddish theater. And there were 2 explosions in Yiddish theatre in Australia. One was, it began in Carlton in 1908, which is an extraordinary story in itself. But it really took off in the late 1930s when, Yankov Weislitz and Ochel Holzer, 2 greats of the Yiddish theatre, from Poland got stuck in Melbourne. You know, one on a world tour, another one was visiting a relative, but they got stuck. The war broke out in the early 1940s. That stage in the Kadima, well, they united all the little theatre groups into one big theatre, the David Herman Theatre, and all those, and they put on, you know, as the old world was burning, they were putting on seasons of 7, 8 different plays per year for a relatively small population, as it still was then, of Yiddish plays, and plays everything from Freud's theories of dreams, you know, I think it was a two-hander with Hochholzer and Weislitz all the way through to the Yiddish theatre classics. I mean, Weislitz staged the Dibuk, the greatest of Yiddish plays, I think you can safely say. In 1938 at the Princess Theatre with an audience of 1,500, many of them non-Jews. And it took both the Jewish community and the general community by storm. And Princess Theatre was one of our big theatres in the centre of the city. So every now and then they'd move out of the Kadima stage and go beyond that to a bigger venue. So, but then the next big explosion was the 1950s and 60s, the late 40s, when you had, coming from Poland, Holocaust survivors, and Melbourne became a large centre of survivors. I mean, you know, it's almost like a joke. People say, why did you come to, well, it's a bitter, black, ironic joke. Why did you come to Melbourne? He says, well, we looked at the map and we wanted to get as far away from where we experienced those horrors as we could. So we came to Melbourne. But actually the reason they came here, rather than Sydney to some extent, is because in Sydney you have more predominance of Hungarian and German Jews. There's Yiddish speakers, but it's not as strong as Melbourne. It's a classical chain migration thing, you know. So there was already something here and they were attracted to that. So then Yiddish theatre had its heyday, you know, an audience of 6,000. And so in the 50s and 60s, going to the Yiddish theatre on a Saturday night was it.
All right, we're gonna zoom back across the Southern Hemisphere to mostly we've been looking at large cities so far, so I wanted to bring in a smaller community that has also been a fascination of mine for many years. I studied Spanish as well as Yiddish in college, and actually had the opportunity to go to this amazing place, Moisésville, or Moisés in the Argentine dialect of Spanish. So this community came out of a Jewish Back to the Land movement, which was a wide-reaching movement in reaction to land ownership restrictions in the Russian Empire. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a man named Baron Maurice de Hirsch. He had his wealth from being one of the builders of the Vienna-Constantinople Railroad. He and his friends attached to this Jewish Back to the Land movement idea and sponsored the settlement of Eastern European Jews in many countries with the idea of creating agricultural Jewish colonies. So Moisésville was the first Jewish agricultural colony in South America. At one time, there was a Yiddish theater, multiple Jewish schools, and a library with over 20,000 books, including many, many in Yiddish, some of which are still there to this day, including something I've never seen anywhere else in the world, which was actually a globe with the place names all in Yiddish. In the late 30s, Moisésville also welcomed Jewish refugees from Germany. And however, the venture of creating a Jewish agricultural colony was not entirely successful. The majority of the second generation relocated to cities for more economic and educational opportunities. So there is still a Jewish presence in the community, but certainly not what it was at its beginning. So here we're going to hear from someone who actually did not himself grow up in Moisésville, but in the region. This is the wonderful Hazen Cantor Lebelechinich.
Like singen in Moisésville, man singen. Se me fek singen, meiste hetele Moisésville. Bist a Yiddische Medine, bist a Stolz in Argentine, Moisésville. Setz ich mir rein in Bahn, Estación La Croce. Dorten sehnen ich kin goyer faran, nur eben bloß gor. Moishe chai, no chai dvoshe, oya gwaldinke farzei. In Argentina hat man geschrieben eine Sachlieder von der Yiddish Städtlach.
So here, just to zoom out for a moment, we're seeing, we've been talking about institutions. Of course, also, art itself is a vehicle for preservation and transmission of Yiddish culture. So these songs are one way that that both Yiddish culture is created and maintained. So next, we're going to go across the world to a place named called Birobidzhan. And we're going to be looking at, again, sort of looking at the literary community as one of the holders of Yiddish culture. So some background on Birobidzhan. In 1928, it became the first realization of Jewish autonomy in the modern world. It was known as the Soviet Jewish Autonomous Oblast. And it was part of a program in 1920s Soviet Union of so-called indigenization. So territories were granted to ethnic minorities to cultivate national languages and cultures within the communist framework. And Jews moved to Birobidzhan from all over, not just from the Soviet Union, but actually from other places in the world as well, for different reasons. So political reasons, really aligning with the idea of this place, some for economic reasons, and others for the idea of having a Jewish autonomous region tied to, again, this sort of back to the land impulse. By the 1930s, by the mid-30s, the Stalinist purges cracked down on ethnic minorities, including the Jews in Birobidzhan. So now, which began an attrition of Jews from this region. So now Jews make up less than 1% of the population in this region, which is still officially named the Jewish Autonomous region. And Yiddish is still its official language, so it's taught in school. There are publications and TV programs even that have Yiddish centered. I myself have not been there, but my wonderful colleague Tanya Panova went there and recorded interviews both in Birobidzhan and then also in other places around the world. So here we're going to hear from Sergo Bengelsdorf, who grew up in Birobidzhan.
Je gedenkt in Birobidzhan, ze geven de literarische woorden, onze Geseder dort gelernt ihre Lieder. Ja. Und sie gewinnen eine Korrespondentin von Birobidzhaner Stern, sie hat geschrieben, welche Artikel nur wegen Menschen, wegen Birobidzhaner Menschen, verschiedene, welche haben nur gehabt Verdiensten für jüdische Gegend. Sie ist gewesen ein schäferischer Menschen, sie ist gewesen eine einzige Freude von allen Schreiber in Birobidzhan. Und in der Schreiber oft gewesen bei uns in der Stube. Mama ist gewesen sehr gute, wie sagt man, kulinarische, sehr gut gekannt machen, gefüllte Fisch und alle jüdische Meicholim.
All right, I'm going to move us on to our last stop because I want to leave time for discussion. And there is a typo here in this slide. I just saw this. It should say Helsinki, but it says Bulawayo in Yiddish. So that was a secret test for those Yiddish readers in the audience to see if you would notice. So Helsinki is a fascinating community that I was very lucky to get to visit and spend some time interviewing. So here we're, ending our tour back in Europe in a sort of unique community in Europe, a story of continuity, an unusual story of continuity of Jewish communities in this region. So brief history, again, this is just an overview, but in 1858, the first Jews were given permission to settle in Finland. It was sort of, it was an area that was barred to Jews, but the law about the rights of veterans and soldiers of the Russian army sort of took over, had precedence over the local laws in that time. So those Jews who were soldiers in the Russian army, including those known as cantonists who had been drafted for the infamous 25-year service, were given permission to settle in Finland. In 1917, Finland declared its independence, and it recognized Jewish residents as full citizens and abolished the previously standing anti-Semitic legal restrictions. And this fascinating thing about Finland in the Second World War, I encourage you to look into this if you're interested. So there were two parts of the Second World War for Finland. First was the Winter War of 39 to 40, where the Soviet Union invades Finland and takes over northern regions. Jews that were in the northern regions, the ceded territories, became refugees. And then there was the continuation war. So from 41 to 44, Finland fought the Soviets, and they fought alongside Nazi Germany. The fact that there was a universal draft meant that Jewish Finns actually fought alongside Germans in a very strange situation of geopolitics. Yiddish has long been a part of the Jewish community in Helsinki. There's been a recent revival of Yiddish via theater and klezmer. So we will hear from Joseph Gideon Bolotowski, the longtime president of the community, past president. Und was weißt ihr wegen der Dorf von Moisés?
Ja, wir wissen alles Ding.
Ja.
Ja, weil das ist gewesen die einzige Medina, wo die Kehila ist geblieben über den Zweiten Weltkrieg. Die einzige von allen die Kehilas im ganzen Mittel- und Mitteleuropa. Davor, wir kennen alles. Man hat uns nicht gehargert, nicht gejagt, gar nicht. Wir haben noch alle Sachen. Sie nicht gewesen sehr in Europa, vor 60 Jahren zurück.
Ja.
Das ist der größte Unterschied zwischen uns und als man nennt, unsere Schreinim, die Jiden von Estland. Wir sind keinmal nicht gewesen über 1800 und sie sind gewesen über 4000. Und 6 sind geblieben und bei uns die ganze Kehile.
Und was noch wollt ihr, dass Menschen sollen wissen wegen der Kehila da?
Ich meine, dass אפשר können sie verstehen, die Jiden, wo sie aufgewachsen in große Kehilles, wie New York, London, Paris, Leningrad, Petersburg, Moskau, Toronto, mit 100.000 von Jiden, wie es ist, zu leben in einer kleinen, isolierte Kehille. Und man kriegt das dann, von wie stark die jüdische Kultur ist. Also man ist weit unter einer kritischen Masse, below a critical mass. Wo die Grenze ist, weiß ich nicht, aber ich meine, etwas 3, 4, 5.000 Juden. Und wenn man ist bloß 1.000, wie kann man aufhalten eine Struktur mit der Schule, mit der Kindergarten, mit der Schule, mit der Beis Kenim, mit der Beis Eilem. Und als noch als Volontären. Zianes. Interessant. Und wenn man noch versteht, dass sie die einzige Kehille, was ist geblieben, intakt, über die Milchome. Die Schweizer, die Engländer, die Schweden, sie verstehen das. Dass Jid in meinen Jahren hat gekannt die Bobes und die Tanten und die Onkel und die Cousinkes und in Europa. Sind nur gewesen da.
Okay, so that concludes our quick tour around the world. And I encourage you to continue exploring. There are many hundreds of hours and thousands of clips like we've seen tonight at yiddishbookcenter.org. And if you'd like to stay in touch, there's an email that you can reach me and my colleagues at. So looking forward to hearing some questions.
Thanks, Christa. So we do have some questions. One of them is, how does one get interviewed for the Wexler Oral History Project?
Great question. So you can go to, so first of all, say we're a small team and we have a long list of people who we're already in touch with, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't reach out to us. We're doing our best to record as many interviews as we can with the resources that we have. So I would encourage you to go to yiddishbookcenter.org. If you navigate to the oral history part of the website, you will find a form, the pre-interview questionnaire. If you want to contact us directly, you can email us at tellyourstory@yiddishbookcenter.org. But if you fill out the pre-interview questionnaire, then you'll be in our system and we will try to interview as soon as possible.
This question kind of relates, and how do you locate speakers, decide on which ones to prioritize, and what's the process of the interview?
Thanks. So yeah, so we have been doing this work for a number of years. And so at this point, we are looking to sort of make the collection as representative as possible. We're not trying to be exhaustive. We can't interview everyone, but we are looking to add stories to the collection from places where we don't have stories or that talk about an aspect of Yiddish culture that we have fewer interviews about. So that's sort of how we're doing our priorities right now.
Someone asked a very interesting question. In your interviews, have you ever encountered a Yiddish dialect you don't understand?
That's great. I love Yiddish dialects, so I've come to really appreciate them, and it's been an amazing education as Yiddish is not my native language, of course. I would say the most challenging dialect for me is actually the Hasidic dialect, because I'm not a Hebrew speaker. When you have more components from Loshen Kodesh, from the religious life integrated into the language, that makes it challenging for me.
Now, you may or may not know this answer, but to put into context the 117 Jewish families in Mosesville, what is the total population there?
I'm not sure, but let me just give a quick look. Yeah, the total population, I'm not sure, actually. I'm not going to be able to find it quickly in a Google search, but I will say for anyone interested, and I believe that we have some program, podcast or public program related to this, that there's a new book that's been translated. There are a couple of books that have been translated recently into English about Mosesville. So if you're curious about that, there's new material in English available.
Someone's asking, just to quickly, how did the Jews survive in Finland again? They were really interested by that.
Yeah, so it had to do with the geopolitics of the war in that region. So for Finland, the main threat was the Soviet Union, who were invading Finnish territory, and this meant that the Finns allied with well, they were fighting off the Soviets. However, in their alliance with the Germans, they were able to maintain enough autonomy of their laws to protect the Jewish community. So there's some interesting articles online about that, again, if people are interested in learning more.
Someone asks, are there any interesting stories behind the speakers that you represented today and how you found them?
Yeah, well, it was a big mix of different people. So, some were recorded at the studio at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. So that's one wonderful way that we can connect with people. As Elizabeth well knows, we have visitors from all over the world that come visit us at the center. So if we know that someone's interested in being interviewed, we can set that up ahead of time. So that was the case with, for example, with Gita Wolpowitz who grew up in Bulawayo. And the rest of the interviews were done out traveling to these places. So that's a different way that we do work. When a number of them, so those interviews we did in Melbourne and in Rio, were done in partnership with local Yiddish organizations. So that's one way that we do our work, sort of tapping into the community and building a collection together. And then finally, when I travel places, for example, Helsinki, the reason I went to Finland was for an oral history conference at a university in Finland. And so anywhere I go, I try to, it's hard to sort of suppress the impulse to connect with Yiddish speakers there. So in that case, as I was planning my trip to Finland, I reached out to some colleagues who connected me with Yiddish speakers there.
Someone's asking, have you interviewed any Yiddish speakers from the Hasidic community?
Yeah, we have actually. Sadly, one of the people we interviewed from that community passed away this week. A wonderful interview with the cantor and music composer Benzion Miller. So I personally, there's some access issues for me personally, you know, to go in and interview folks in that community. So for some of those interviews, we work with colleagues. Our colleague Henke Snetsky, who works also at the New England Conservatory and founded the long-standing klezmer band, has done some work with us with musicians in that community, in Hasidic communities in Brooklyn, for example. And we've also done a couple of interviews with folks who grew up in the Hasidic world, but who've left. Yeah.
You folks are curious, and we might want to repeat this. How can they access these interviews from home? And also, can they search interviewees based on the ones they saw today?
Yes, so if you go to yiddishbookcenter.org, and you can navigate to the oral history section of the website either through the menu, you look for collections and then oral histories, or you can just go straight to the search bar and look for people's names. You can search by name or topic. So if you're interested in a particular topic, let's say you're interested in a particular place, you can just write that right into the search bar. And if you go to filters, you can filter to the collection where you want to see oral histories. Another great place to find our oral histories, in addition to the archive of these wonderful virtual public programs, is the Yiddish Book Center's YouTube channel.
And I think this will be our final question. What brought you into working with oral histories?
Yeah, well, I have always been a big listener, so I think that is something that I have always enjoyed. And so when I began at the Yiddish Book Center in 2009 as a fellow, we were looking for different programs that we might expand into, and oral history was one of the projects that was floated. We were very fortunate to get pilot funding from Deborah and Peter Wexler to try it out. And I guess it went well because we've been doing it for 15 years.
Well, thank you, Christa. If anyone has any continued questions they want to send, they can send them to programs@yiddishbookcenter.org and we'll pass them on to Christa. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to thank our members for their continued support. It's with you that we are able to put programs like this evening's program on tonight. If you would like to support us, you can always go to yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Next on the list is on Thursday, February 20th at 7 p.m. We're going to have Litvkas in Love, a conversation with Professor David Roski. And to register for this event and to view our calendar, please go to upcoming events at yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Until next time, stay well and stay healthy. Thanks so much, everyone.